Hello, welcome back to everyone who was with us last night and this morning, and welcome anyone who is joining us now for the 1:30 session on Conspirituality, QAnon and the far right. This is the first of two sessions that feature speakers from Australia, and this is mainly due to time zones. We prioritized the UK and US and EU and Canadian speakers in the earlier sessions because it was a much easier time for them to make it. And now we're focusing more on the Australian context. So as with all sessions, this session will be recorded, and I'd like to begin the session with an acknowledgement of country. I'm actually up in Port Douglas at the moment. So I would like to formally acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of this part of Queensland that we are meeting on today in real world and virtually, the beautiful country where rainforest meets the sea. I'm advised that Port Douglas is the northernmost part of the Irukandji saltwater Javakai people that they would traverse. And it was also a shared area between them and the Gugu Yalanji people. I would like to respectfully recognize them as the original nations from these lands and the keepers of culture and strong traditional practices of law and governance to these areas. We pay our respects to the elders past, present, and future, and ask the ancestors of this area for safe passage for all of us who are real and virtual visitors to these lands as we conduct our business here today. So we have three speakers, or actually we have four speakers, but three presentations in this panel. So we're going to begin with Matthew Sharpe from Deakin University, and then from Geoff Boucher and Helen Young from Deakin University also. And then we're really delighted that Sarah Wilson of sarahwilson.com is able to join us today. And I will provide more information and bios about all of these speakers just before they commence their talks. So each presenter will have 20 minutes to speak. And I will remind each presenter when they have about 1 minute left, I'll pop back on the screen and then you'll see that it's almost time to finish. To all the participants, we really welcome your questions at any time during the session. So please type and enter those questions into the Q&A box at any time, and we will answer or get to answering those questions at the end. And due to the nature of this topic, we ask all participants to engage respectfully, and any abusive or disruptive behaviour will not be tolerated, and we reserve the right to remove you or anyone from the colloquium should that occur. So to begin, I'm delighted to introduce Matthew Sharpe, who gained his PhD in philosophy and social theory at University of Melbourne and has an MA in policy studies from the University of Tasmania. He has taught philosophy at Deakin University since the early 2000s and has co-authored, among other things, The Times Will Suit Them, Postmodern Conservatism in Australia, together with Geoff Boucher, one of our other presenters today. So Matthew, the floor is yours.
So thank you, Anna. Thank you, Anki. It's a lot of work to organise conferences like this, and I certainly have gained a lot from the two sessions I was able to come to. Today, I want to challenge three ideas: that the far right has no ideas, that the far right was and is not attractive to intellectuals, and therefore that we can safely not study the works that they produce and their intellectual forefathers if we want to prevent them from radicalising more people. I think we're inclined, because of the normative horror at what National Socialism and other species of fascism and kindred regimes have wrought, to argue as follows. Fascists exalt the rule of force and strength over weakness, intellectualism, and fancy ideas like social justice, equality, or the moral law. Far-right voices target independent, rootless intellectuals and artists, and when they're in power, they censor, exile, and murder them. Interwar fascist ideology and a good deal of what is pulsing online today appeals not to the mind, but to emotion, fear, hatred, anger. So far-right figures, whether pre or in power, treat ideas with lassitude and cynicism as weapons in order just to win, to defeat foes. There can be nothing of intellectual interest in any of this, and we as intellectuals are above all of that. My claim is that none of these true premises validate the conclusions that fascism, neo-fascism, and today forms of right-wing libertarianism, misogyny, ethno-nationalism, and acceleration either had or have no appeal to some intellectuals and artists, either had or have no intellectual bases capable of converting mature adults, particularly experiencing forms of social, political, and economic alienation. And at different phases that fascism and the far right did and does not use and benefit from the ideological support of intellectuals. To understand the place of ideas and intellectuals in far right movements in the past, I believe can therefore provide some lessons for these subjects today. So what I want to do now is firstly give an account of historical fascism and the two-way exchange between intellectuals and fascism, based on research in that area. Secondly, I want to talk about what I call the when question. What stages of these movements do intellectuals have the most direct influence? And from there, I'm going to try and draw some lessons for the Q&A for people to reflect upon as to whether any of this has pertinence for what we're experiencing globally today. Okay, so fascism has become, in a way that ironically favours real fascists, an all-purpose term of abuse. Its semantics are disputed heatedly by scholars. Things aren't made any simpler by the ways that fascism names, can name a type of political movement, a form of government, and a way of thinking about politics, which can't be identified with either the political movement or a form of government. So I'm going to use Robert Paxton's The Anatomy of Fascism, which gives 9 features which characterise fascist ideology. I recognise that Paxton is one voice in a crowded field, but I find his definition at least workable for my purposes and our purposes. Fascist ideologies embrace, as you can see, a sense of overwhelming crisis, the primacy of the group, the belief that one's group is a victim, dread of the group's decline under the corrosive effects of individualistic liberalism, levelling egalitarianism, class conflict, and alien influences. The need for closer integration, therefore, of a pure community by consent if possible, but other means can be considered if needed. The need for authority by natural leaders, always male, culminating in a national chief who alone is capable of incarnating the group's destiny. The superiority of that leader's instincts over abstract and universal reason, the beauty of violence and the efficacy of will, and the right of the chosen people to dominate others by the sole criterion of their greater alleged prowess within a Darwinian struggle. So if we take this definition as sufficient, I think we can ask 3 questions. On the one hand, what did fascist movements, including Nazism in Germany, need from intellectuals for any of this? On the other hand, symmetrically, why were some intellectuals attracted to such a program? And thirdly, what kinds of ideas and scientific ideas was fascist ideology able to tolerate and integrate as against the many others, which clearly it is not able to? The first answer, I think, is thankfully relatively simple on the left-hand side. Like any political movement, intellectuals are a potential source of ideas to orient and justify actions, particularly controversial and extreme actions. And secondly, they're a source of cultural credibility in the battle to win hegemony and to win more concrete forms of government. As for the second question as to why intellectuals would be attracted to any of this, drawing on numerous studies on this subject, I think I propose 8 psychological, biographical, sociological, philosophical, and political reasons why some intellectuals, and of course not all of us, are drawn to such ideas, the ideas that we find in extremists within fascism and forms of Nazism, and you can see them on the right there. There's an attraction to an antinomian revolutionary movement, which aestheticizes politics and promises the liberation of aggression and of sexuality, at least for dominant males. Especially amongst broadly conservative thinkers, fascism is attractive as a movement which will promise to reinstate a sense of the sacred versus modern materialism, just soulless, spiritless, lacks life, energy, vitality, as a means to call out and destroy the real gap between modern liberal ideals like liberty and equality and the material reality by adopting a more openly cynical stance, or metacritical stance, to use Lasordo's term, which is experienced by followers as one of greater authenticity, where you just accept that power, blood, inequality, soil, race, struggle, and so on, that's reality. And there's going to be no more complaining. 4, out of agreement with the eschatological sense that Western history is a history of decline, usually coupled with some utopian vision of an idealised antiquity that can be recovered. 5, out of a shared hostility to the decadence or degeneration of modern egalitarian, liberal, democratic, socialist societies. 6, out of careerism and fear in the proto-fascist state, and then when fascists come to power. This is unfortunately not an illustrious history. 7, out of gendered and racial prejudices and hatred, which technical training in no way affects or eliminates or changes. And 8, out of conceit of their own intellectual and thus wider superiority over the masses. Sort of misoclea might be the Greek word, hatred of the crowd, the mob. Okay, so the answer to the third question about which ideas as well as intellectuals fascists are attracted to kind of follows, of course, from what Paxton has indicated. Far-right actors need for their purposes ideas, including scientific ideas, so they're not simply anti-scientific at all. They will be attracted to selected sciences like eugenics, social Darwinism, racial pseudoscience, linguistic pseudoscience, and selective readings of IQ research. Also various forms of biopolitical sort of preoccupations, particularly with birth rates. And all of these ideas will need to speak to or provide evidence or larger framing narratives about the 8 things you can see on your screen there: cultural or historical decline, the idealisation of the in-group and victimisation of the same group, naming and framing the enemy, including through conspiracy narratives, which we've been hearing about, led historically, of course, in Hitler's Germany by the Jewish world conspiracy. But today there are many more. The extra rational bases of charismatic salvific leadership, like Trump as God Emperor and so on. The greatness of an idealised, mythologized past, which can become the new future through will and revolution. The hard truths of struggle, inequality or rank order, sexual difference, irresolvable racial, cultural and historical differences. The naturalisation, finally, of distinctions between genders, peoples, as well as types of masters and slaves, or master and slave races. So philosophies, theories, and scientific studies which do not propound but ignore or oppose one or more of these ideas quite simply will not be lastingly attractive to anyone on the far right. And it's important to say because there are various debates in which that doesn't seem to be recognised. So when does this happen? It's highly misleading, I think, to kind of play this all out as if fascism sort of and the far right doesn't change in response to its environment. It does. Historically, it is now, and it will in future. So Paxton and Mosser in particular, George Mosser, ask the when question when they examine intellectuals and fascism in a way which I think is extremely informative. I want to ask, therefore, the same kind of symmetrical questions about when some intellectuals are most attracted to fascism from one side, and then when fascist movements from the other side are most attracted to intellectuals and the ideas and cultural capital they can bring. And the answer is really revealing because it's convergent. Namely, the most appealing phase of fascism for relatively independent, potentially sympathetic students and intellectuals is the pre-phase. So if we do accept a parallel of then and now, that would be now. There are several reasons for this. First, fascist ideology, always relatively fluid, is most open at this time because it's least bound by the work of reality testing, which is necessitated by governing. As Mosser comments, in all of this, it is important to keep the chronological factor in mind. The intellectuals were attracted to a fascism which seemed open-ended, and whose ideology with its organic framework gave it a superb openness to artistic creativity, at least in their imagination. So consider the avant-garde embrace of fascism in Italy amongst futurists, many of whose positions are comparable at the level of ideas with forms of far-right accelerationism and dark Enlightenment thought today. In the 1920s, says Paxton, fascism seemed the very essence of revolt against stuffy bourgeois conformity. Its champions showed, just as well as Marinetti's futurism, that one could be rebellious and avant-garde without having to swallow the levelling, cosmopolitan, pacifistic, feministic earnestness of the left. Sound familiar? The attraction is at this stage also most eagerly reciprocated. Fascist political agents at this stage are involved in a radical countercultural movement aiming to overthrow the modern claims of liberty, equality and cosmopolitanism, as they are institutionalised in forms of constitutional government. Intellectuals who are, as it were, paid to independently consider and reconsider established opinions, at this point can provide framing alternative explanations and narratives which create the cultural or spiritual preconditions for fascist takeover, what Alain de Benoit and others on the far right today call metapolitics. Their presence on podiums can also convince neutrals that the far right movement is worth taking seriously. Here is Paxton again. The intellectuals of the early days had several kinds of impact. First, they helped create a space for fascist movements by weakening the elite's attachment to Enlightenment values, until then very widely accepted and applied in concrete form in constitutional government. Finally, intellectuals helped operate a seismic emotional shift in which the left was no longer the only recourse for the angry and for those inebriated by dreams of change. What happens when fascism succeed in overthrowing constitutional government, paradoxically, is that intellectuals tend to become less important. Example after example shows a pattern where intellectuals like Martin Heidegger, for example, experience initial enthusiasm, bid for influence, and then experience a twofold disillusionment. Firstly, they become disillusioned at their own incapacity to lead the leaders who have instrumentally used them and then dropped them. Secondly, they become disillusioned with the compromises necessary for the party that is now in government, which needs to make strategic banal compromises, run the trains, hold the Olympics, and so on. So Moffat comments of the expressionist author are not Bronnen, but other cases of the pattern include Ernst Niekisch of Marspan, Gaetano Mosca, Giovanni Prasolini, Ernst Junger, Ezra Pound, Gottfried Benn, Carl Schmitt, Martin Heidegger, Oswald Spengler. Mossa says the following: a writer like Bronnen greatly admired a faction of the SA for wanting a revolution, although this longing was little more than a desire to release a pent-up dynamic. Bronnen lost his innocence. His reaction to this disillusionment was typical of that of many other intellectuals who joined the Nazis for similar reasons. Half-hearted gestures, pathetic in their futility against what they called revolution betrayed. Fascist intellectuals came to believe that theirs would be a spiritual revolution, which through a new type of man would renew the nation and the world. In reality, this revolution became enmeshed in the very middle-class values it was supposed to fight. So that's a quote from George Moss's very informative piece, Fascism and the Intellectuals. So let me now proffer 9 conclusions, which may be generalisable to different degrees today, and I leave that for the discussion. Let me proffer these conclusions from this brief analysis of the troubling role of intellectuals in historical fascism, keeping in mind the myths that I want to challenge here, that fascism then and the far right now has no intellectual credentials, that no intellectuals then and now could be powerfully drawn to it, and that therefore teachers in disciplines like mine, philosophy, should not even consider this as a possibility for our own students. Given the constraints of time, I proffer the following conclusions to you with the necessary acknowledgement that their relevance today will depend on our assessment of the continuities and discontinuities of the different manifestations of the far right with their intellectual and political forebears. I'm more than happy to discuss these questions and issues in Q&A. So number 1, because fascism was anti-intellectualist does not mean it, and hence forms of neo-fascism today, has no ideas and that intellectuals aren't vital to it. 2, intellectuals were needed at each stage of fascism to provide credibility, ideas, and authoritative justifications, especially for extreme actions like revolution from out of power and ethnic cleansing once within power. 3, there is much in fascist and far-right thought which is attractive to some intellectuals, especially at risk young alienated white males. Aesthetics, violence, rebellion, vindication of their misunderstood sense of their own superiority, hatred, hatred of the crowd, hatred of women, longing for revenge against progressive ideas, and so on. 4, fascism and the far-right ideologies nevertheless circle around a core set of anti-Enlightenment ideas which can and do take different intellectual justifications. Hostility to the values of cosmopolitanism and equality, cultural, racial, spiritual relativism, celebration of rank order, strength, violence, war, struggle, and narratives of cultural and spiritual decline from an idealised past. Surrounding this core five, especially in the early phases of a movement, there is ideological flexibility in which individuals, including established intellectuals, can try to input their own myths, Nazism and being, Nazism and the occult, Nazism and the will to power, and so on. 6, intellectuals were especially important at the beginning of historical fascism when their movements were out of power or working to stabilise a still unsecured grip on the national populations. 7, the importance of ideas and intellectuals in the beginning of fascism comes above all from their metapolitical role in destructively discrediting existing institutions and values. 8, it attempts to exonerate precursor proto and fascist intellectuals due to their disillusionment at fascism in power, and the distancing of empowered parties from these intellectuals' ideas fundamentally misunderstands the role of intellectuals in making fascism possible. And we need to understand which ideas were especially important for this work of discrediting and ensure that when we teach them to our students, we inform them that this is the historical role that they have played. Number 9, the idea that we should avoid understanding these things, since to understand the far right is to give it credit, only makes us less able to identify and combat the spread of these toxic ideas. To quote the philosopher Francis Bacon, and to conclude, it is not possible to join serpentine wisdom with Columbine innocence, except men know exactly all the conditions of the serpent, his baseness and going upon his belly, his volubility and lubricity, his envy and sting, and the rest, that is, all the forms and natures of evil. For without this, virtue lieth open and unfenced. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Matthew. Okay, we're going to move straight on. So Matthew, if you can stop sharing your screen, and then Geoff can upload his slides. So I'm going to introduce both Geoff and Helen as they'll be presenting together. I believe Helen is not well today, so I think Geoff will be presenting and Helen will stay for as long as she's able, and can or cannot answer questions depending on how she's feeling at the time. No worries at all. We really hope you feel better soon. So Geoff Boucher is an associate professor in the Faculty of Arts and Education at Deakin University. He is the author of a number of books on historical materialism and continental philosophy, including Adorno Reframed and Habermas and Literature. Dr. Helen Young is a lecturer in the School of Communication and Creative Arts at Deakin University. She is a fellow at the Deakin Motion Lab and a member of the Avert Network. Her latest monograph is Race and Popular Fantasy Literature, Habits of Whiteness. So thank you again, Geoff and Helen, and once again, the floor is yours.
Thank you. We don't have a slideshow, we just have a traditional paper, which I'll now read. Here's a quote from the Marxist literary critic, George Lukács. Quote, "The effect of art, the immersion of the recipient in the action of the work of art, their complete penetration into the effect of the special world of the work of art, results from the fact that the work of art by its very nature offers a truer, more complete, more vivid, and more dynamic reflection of reality than the recipient otherwise possesses," end quote. So the ideas in this paper arose from discussion about what literary studies researchers could bring to the space of studies of religious belief, conspiracy theories, and authoritarian politics. It's not news that novels are part of the recruiting arsenal of the far right. The Turner Diaries has been termed its Bible and is associated with numerous acts of violence. In this paper, we move beyond analysis of fascist literature to present the case that conspiracy theories are structured like fictional narratives, and we conjecture that they are experienced as fiction-like by adherents. There are 4 important consequences of this position. It explains why the structural components of conspiracy theories, agency, events, morals, simplify reality. It suggests one reason why, despite the manifest weakness of the epistemological credentials of conspiracy theories, adherents typically do not care about debunking. It clarifies why we often see fictional narratives as the genetic origin of conspiracy theories and how believers often become co-authors. And finally, it suggests some insights into their power to recruit and to radicalise. Now, in this paper by conspiracy theory, what is exclusively meant is two things. One, an explanatory account of unexplained phenomena based in secretive collusion, where the account's epistemic status is compromised by manifestly insufficient evidence or egregiously defective argument. Two, where the gap between the beliefs of competent actors and the beliefs of conspiracy adherents can be intersubjectively accessed through multiple demonstrations of the epistemic falsity of the account, or in short. For us, conspiracy theory is a pejorative term that designates a false theory, and conspiratorial belief is held despite the accessibility of falsifications. Now, two considerations about the nature of fiction clarify why there exists an affinity between conspiracy theories and fictional narratives. And these go to these 2 points, the points about a false theory and dogmatic belief. Classical fictional narratives, for instance, realist fiction, exemplified in the 19th century novel, differ from real reports in 2 key respects: emplotment and figuration. Emplotment simplifies the real world, while figuration removes the resulting representation from reality. The consequence of this is that literary truthfulness depends on judgments about the resemblance between the fictional universe and what typically happens in the real world. So no reader of a realist fiction thinks that the sentences of the text are assertive claims with literal truth values. Rather, they think that a work is truthful because it captures what universally happens in typical cases. These theoretical considerations make it possible to develop a typology of those kinds of conspiracy theory which directly depend on fictional narratives. There are 2 kinds: fictional narratives which are mistaken for or fraudulently misrepresented as true reports. And the second kind would be untrue reports whose montage is coordinated by a fictional narrative. Now, we think that these are not just sideshow freaks in the world of conspiracy theories, but rather are among the most important species in the bestiary. There are 2 highly consequential examples. The fictional narrative fraudulently represented as a true report would include the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was a fictional narrative that was misrepresented as a conspiracy theory and which, because of the ascent of fascism in the 1930s, became a warrant for genocide. And the second one would be QAnon, an ensemble of untrue reports whose narrative emplotment involves avant-garde techniques that nonetheless depend on a quite conventional story. Throughout the QAnon universe, pervasive irony indicates that the correct position of reception is to use the theory as a prop in a game of make-believe. The fictional origins of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is an established result, and we're not going to discuss that here. We're now going to discuss the fictional affinities of the conspiracy narrative co-presented by Q and some of the central Q bakers and Q teachers. These include Pamphlet Anon, Baruch the Scribe, Tracy Beans, Q Bread Baker, and Jerome Corsi. So what we will call QAnon is the constantly evolving conspiracy field centred on the mysterious postings of the Q Clearance Patriot, or Q, and decoded, i.e. elaborated, by numerous Q bakers and Q teachers, as well as the so-called army of Anons. QAnon, so defined, is a meta-conspiracy theory constructed by suggestively linking together existing conspiracy theories about various topics, COVID-19, 5G telephony, the 9/11 attacks, media manipulation, world government, global banking, CIA psyops, and so forth, by linking these around the themes of the deep state and elite Satanism. The current scholarly consensus seems to be that the failure of QAnon, the QAnon narrative to predict the defeat of Trump in the elections, and therefore the non-manifestation of some central elements such as the storm and the awakening, may alter the direction of QAnon, but are unlikely to result in its instant collapse. The political significance of QAnon, of course, is that it provides a space for a syncretism of the fascist movement with fundamentalist Christianity, within which, importantly, although Q posts only hint at anti-Semitic themes, the Q teachers soon go ahead and fill them in. Ultimately, we think the only story that makes the plots of QAnon work is the same one that is told by the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, about a Jewish global conspiracy to construct a world government capable of destroying non-Jewish, especially Aryan, civilization. This would provide the hidden unity of Satan and the state under Jewish control of the world, and it's the only really consistent way to integrate the fundamentalist and the fascist elements of QAnon. In other words, the medieval blood libel, the slander that Jews engage in ritual sacrifice dedicated to Satan because they're the enemies of Christ, is the origin of the notion of satanic ceremonies. And the deep state is in reality just a rebadged version of the Zionist occupation government central to fascist fantasy. This is scarcely surprising in light of the location of Q in the centre of the libertarian ensemble of 4chan and its successors, and of many of the Q teachers and Q bakers on /poll, a board on Reddit which is dominated by fascist ideology. It's tempting to say that QAnon is structured like an avant-garde fictional experiment in the genus of postmodern literature, a kind of pastiche of conspiracy theories articulated in the spirit of pervasive irony. But the postmodern connection misses what is novel about QAnon. Namely, it is, of course, a crowdsourced conspiracy montage, one that evolves through the efforts of the Anons to make narrative links. In this, it strongly resembles a fan community and also a live-action role-playing game. The affinities of QAnon to a live-action role-play are possibly genetic and certainly structural. It's definitely possible that QAnon originates as a hoax or game that's also a political intervention by the central Q bakers such as Pamphlet, Baruch, Beans, Baker and Corsi, in concert perhaps with Jim Watkins, the owner of 4chan and successors. Researcher James Beverley cites Q-bred Baker, quote, "Think about, do you really think some special intel person would know all these Chan terms? Autists, Anons, Bakers, normies? Is it clearer now? We made all this shit up," end quote. The narrative role Q has, played by Q has lots of precedence on the /poll Reddit, and Q's narrative itself is a syncretism of existing /poll theories. We have this from Bellingcat in particular. Indeed, the milieu of the /poll Reddit is one in which the gamification of conspiracy narratives has long been the norm. Whether or not QAnon originated as a live-action roleplay, it is certainly structured like a live-action roleplay. And what we mean by this is the constant self-referential play and ironic anticipations of predictive failure, if disinformation is necessary, which are often interpreted as epistemic evasions, actually we think indicate within this milieu that QAnon is a game. Specifically, it's a narrative game of make-believe, played using existing conspiracy theories and now a worldwide audience. That is to say, it's a consensual fiction about a global conspiracy. That doesn't mean that it lacks seriousness or menace. It can catalyse terrorism, especially when some naive readers take it as literal claims. But more significantly, it can recruit into this emerging synthesis of fascism and fundamentalist because it's taken by readers as truthful rather than as true. Even if no prediction or prophecy of Q or the Q teachers turns out to be true, for true believers, its truthfulness is that even if there is no X, insert the conspiracy, even if there is no X, this is exactly, nonetheless, the exact sort of thing that the deep state or the Satanist cabals would do, what universally happens in typical cases. The interpretive aspects of this process of simultaneously reading and writing the Q narrative takes us further into its reception by individuals and in communities. Lisa Sunshine's theory of mind, developed at the nexus of cognitive psychology and literary criticism, suggests that humans are evolutionarily inclined to engage in interpretation of fictional narratives, and that we do this for understanding the complex realities of human social life, generating, along the way, positive affect by doing so. Sunshine argues specifically that when lacking information to the contrary, we are evolutionarily inclined to mind read characters, ascribing mental and emotional states to them that would account for the actions described, the statements made, and so on. Our interpretations are constrained by the context described in the narrative and by what we've previously learned from fiction and other sources about why people act, speak in particular ways, and so forth. The creation of Q as a fictional character, a conventional, mysterious stranger type familiar from the thriller genre, brings this theory of mind into play, evoking our evolutionary need to interpret the actions of fictional characters in ways that align with our preconceptions of the world. In the sites that generate the Q narrative, these preconceptions, as we've suggested, are shaped by immersion in the pre-existing disparate conspiracy theory matrix that QAnon draws together. We might also consider in this respect Sunshine's theorisation of cognitive slippage, where even though the reader knows the characters and story are not real, they, quote, begin to feel that there is much more than meets the eye on the page, end quote. Sunshine suggests that, quote, on some level, our evolved cognitive architecture does not fully distinguish between real and fictional people, end quote. There is perhaps then a particular cognitive vulnerability to conspiracy theories which are structured and produced as fictional narratives and featuring characters whose motivations, thoughts, feelings, and so on can be interpreted. QAnon fora, then, are not just locations where the meta-narrative is generated, but where it is interpreted as part of the very same process. These are interpretive communities, a term commonly associated with media fandom. The resemblance is worth pursuing because it offers some insights into the process by which QAnon and other radicalising narratives transform gateway effects such as revulsion linked to consensual agreement on what's disgusting, wrong and unjust into the combination of destructive hatred and fury that is characteristic of QAnon. The resemblances are briefly as follows. Fan connections with the core textual object are grounded in affect rather than reasoned critique based on external criteria such as aesthetic principles. Members invest not only time and energy, but emotional, social, and at times economic capital. Participation in fan communities and in-group identification is linked to psychological benefits and well-being. But popular cultural fandom writ large can also be a highly toxic space, particularly for people from marginalised groups. And there are numerous direct connections to the far right. Affect is the chief currency in online fan communities. Memberships of fan communities necessitates participation in identity work. One becomes and remains part of the in-group by interpreting the core textual object in the correct, supposedly, way, and by feeling the right thing in the right way, or at least by performing such emotions. Interpretations and thus identities are policed by dominant voices and the discourses that they adopt. Those discourses are typically linked to political and ideological discourses and identities which are outside the community, for instance, around race and gender. Creating new stories through fan fiction, for example, filling in gaps in the canonical text or creating prehistories for characters, or speculating about future canonical events, are typical and essential fan activities that are simultaneously interpretive and productive. We can think here of Sunshine's cognitive slippage and of live-action role-play narratives. The perpetual processes of interpretation, which can range across thousands and tens of thousands of conversations, not only exclude and weed out participants who are interpreting and therefore identifying incorrectly, but they can intensify the correct emotional and interpretive positions through repetition and reinforcement. Agreement with others heightens feelings of belonging and well-being, rewarding the adoption of in-group beliefs, logics, and effective orientations. And the latter, we think, is particularly important given the interest in emotion in research on radicalisation to violent extremism. Q forums display a markedly similar hermeneutic practice to media fan forums. Feeling and expressing affect both through and in response to the interpretive elites that construct the Q narrative is rewarded within the community, resulting in greater in-group belonging and feelings of well-being. Similar patterns can be seen in overtly far-right digital forums where discussions of everything from plumbing services to history circle back to reaffirmations of shared belief and commitment to anti-Semitism or white supremacy. Again, time limits what we can say, but we suspect there is also a kind of transferal or resemblance of hermeneutic practice between evangelical Christianity and the far-right or QAnon forums. Considering conspiracy theories as fictions reorients our focus away from the author or instigator and their ideas towards narrative and reception communities. This reveals particular dynamics in the co-creation and collective interpretation of conspiracy theories, which closely resemble the practices and functioning of well-understood live-action role-play and fan communities. The theories and methodologies of literary and fan studies, then, may indeed help us to better understand the power of conspiracy theories to recruit and to radicalise. Thank you.
Thank you, Geoff, and thank you, Helen, right on time. Can I just please remind people to type questions in the Q&A box? We have one question sitting there for Matthew, but it'll be great to have a few more. And now I'm going to introduce our final speaker, Sarah Wilson. So Sarah is a former journalist and TV presenter, author, and activist. She wrote the New York Times bestsellers I Quit Sugar and First We Make the Beast Beautiful. She also founded the largest wellness website in Australia, iquitsugar.com. But in 2018, Sarah closed the business and gave all her money to charity. She now builds and enables charity projects that engage humans with each other and campaigns on mental health and climate issues. Her latest book, This One Wild and Precious Life, is a soul's journey through the complexities of climate change, coronavirus, racial inequalities, and our disconnection from what matters. And we are delighted to have you with us today, Sarah. Thank you for making this time.
Thank you so much, Anna. It's lovely to be here talking with you all, this nebulous group out there in the webosphere. Look, it's a topic that I'm not as academically qualified as many of the speakers who've been speaking today to speak upon, but I will endeavour to share with you my material experience, a hands-on experience. I've traversed both the wellness and spiritual realm with my work as per Anna's introduction, and also have been embedded in the social media space, in the hashtag MSM space, and most recently I've written this book, This One Wild and Precious Life, which covers off a lot of the topics that many of the speakers earlier today have been speaking on, and which I think actually explains a little of what's going on at a grassroots level with this phenomenon. Look, as a bit of background, I was a journalist with mainstream media, about as mainstream as you can get, with News Corp for many years. I did my training with the Murdoch media. I then worked for Kerry Packer as the editor of Cosmopolitan, and as per the introduction, with a bunch of other media outlets. However, about 12 years ago, I got very unwell, an autoimmune disease that saw me pull out of everything. And I did what was very peak wellness, or at least peak nascent wellness. And I packed myself up and moved to an army shed in the forest outside Byron Bay, which I'm sure all of you would have done if given the chance. So this was very much the early days of the wellness realm. And it was 10 years ago that I actually started the I Quit Sugar movement, in the sense that I actually quit sugar because I was desperate for a topic for a weekly column I was writing for a newspaper magazine. It started as an experiment But eventually it got really interesting. I went down a non-algorithmic rabbit hole because they didn't exist at the time, or at least the algorithmic rabbit holes, that is. And I attended obesity summits. I got very embedded in the science of it. And rather than emitting a bunch of tweets overnight in a sort of a ramble, espousing all of my ideas, I actually researched the topic for 2 years before I came out with my I Quit Sugar books and the program. And just to be very, very clear here, and I should just say, sorry, that social media emerged at this point. When I started, Twitter had just arrived in Australia, and of course I was there as all the other social media platforms emerged, and I was an early adopter in this space. And so this is why I'm often called sort of the founder of this wellness realm here in Australia. And in many ways, I feel like I did create somewhat of a beast. Now, I should flag that my I Quit Sugar business did go global. It went into about 52 countries around the world. I managed to generate a fair bit of cash from it. And I just want to flag very upfront here that I gave all of that money to charity. And in part because halfway through the journey, I started to see some concerns I had in the wellness realm. And as I started to speak out on it, I needed to ensure I did not have vested interests. So I'm just making sure everybody's clear on that. I did, however, attract an audience that followed me from my days as a cosmopolitan editor and then doing TV. And this was a young female, predominantly female crowd of people who were starting to ask interesting questions and figured that they could follow in my footsteps. They were a great deal 10, 20 years younger than me, and entered into this space with very little training, very little understanding of the science. And it was a lot of care and very little responsibility. And some of the names you might remember, Belle Gibson, Jessica Ainscough, who both wound up in some tragic circumstances as a result of their involvement in this space and exploiting it and not necessarily understanding the science. That's my experience. I've observed a whole range of trends, of course, during this past decade, and the full evolution and conflation of the wellness and spiritual realm with some of these alt-right conspiracy theories that we are now familiar with today. It sort of passed through paleo, keto stuff, activated almonds, the whole Pete Evans phenomenon, and of course, today's conflation of these two very odd groups, the alt-right and the wellness spiritual realm. And I think Geoff, Helen and Matthew have alluded to why these two have met. But I endeavour to give you a bit of a, I guess, practical insight into how this is working actually in Australia at the moment. And I should also point out that I'm no expert in QAnon or the alt-right, and in fact, it wasn't given a heads up that this was the category I was speaking in. So forgive me, but I'll try to weave in my thoughts as we go. So look, it's a couple of thoughts that I just wanted to share with you. The first is that this movement, this wellness spiritual movement of the last 10 years started out with some very legitimate questioning of big pharma, of big food and big oil. And the movement did expose quite a number of vested interests in the sugar industry, also the anxiety industry. Of course, anxiety arrived as a disorder in 1980, 1 year after the first anti-anxiety drug was invented. We're all familiar with these kinds of connections. But this concern obviously morphed into areas where the science was pretty solid, and the questions were worth asking, but essentially once the science rolled in, we all needed to sort of back off and accept the science. Now, what has happened, I think this has all escalated in the last 18 months to 2 years, as the doubt and uncertainty in the world has escalated. And of course, COVID being part of it, but I think the climate crisis has had a lot to do with it as well, and political fragmentation that's happened around the world. And so what started out as some legitimate questioning morphed into almost a vigilante superiority as we tried to separate ourselves from those who were the problem. What it provided for many people in the wellness and spiritual realm is a sense of agency and control, to be in possession of knowledge that others do not have. And I think that has obviously seen a lot of these theories take off in this space as they try to separate themselves from those who have not done their own research. Hashtag haven't done their own research. I would also add that it's very appropriate and legitimate to be outraged and somewhat suspicious of authority at the moment. Faith in democracy around the world is at an all-time low. And I think we can see what's happening with our leadership at the moment. There is very legitimate concerns for centralised governments and so on who are controlling certain types of information. And so I think that there's legitimate cause for concern. However, this outrage has been misguided. Another point that I wish to raise is that this is all stemming from a fear that we're all feeling, a sense of doubt and uncertainty and an overwhelm. And I'm often asked whether it's money or power that is fueling some of these voices in the wellness and spiritual realm online. And many people in this space are extremely baffled. How can people we know get so caught up in this? And it must be about money. It must be about trying to sort of get ahead in some sort of way. But I actually don't think so. I think it's primarily stemming from fear and a disconnect and a craving for belonging. Vivek Murthy, the former Surgeon General in the US, brought out a book called Together in the middle of the pandemic last year. And he made the point that in a crisis, what we do is seek out a tribe. This has always happened, and during a war, we will go and bunker down together. We would congregate. So when we're thirsty, we seek out water. When we're hungry, we seek out food. And when we're feeling in fear, when we're in a crisis, we will seek out the tribe. Now, in 2020 or 2021, this has taken on a very particular form. What we will do is we will actually revert to our primal instincts. That includes seeking out social proof over science. And that's what we've always done. So we want to get our information from people, our tribe, people who look like us. And we'll, in fact, trust false COVID information, even if we know it to be false. We will still share it on social media, and a number of studies have shown this, because the sense of belonging in a time of crisis is paramount. And so we will actually overlook the science, we'll overlook what we know to be rationally true in order to connect to a like-minded tribe. And it's the same reason why we all bought toilet paper. We saw what other people were doing, even though logically we knew it made no sense to hoard toilet paper when it wasn't really about to run out. But because we saw everybody else do it, we felt we needed to be part of that movement. So it's a very it's a very evolutionary biologically sort of, it makes sense from an evolutionary biological point of view, I suppose. And of course, this has happened before. So many of you would have heard of the conspiracies that have emerged kind of in tandem with the anti-COVID, anti-mask, anti-vaccine sort of stuff, of children being held under tunnels. So I get multiple emails from people telling me about Daniel Andrews during the shutdown in Melbourne, was using all of this to hide children under tunnels, in tunnels under Melbourne, for sex exploitation purposes. Now, the children being kept in tunnels for sex purposes is a theory that's actually popped up throughout history. And in fact, somebody wrote a book about it in the 1980s. And it stemmed actually from another point of crisis. And this is when women were heading back into the workforce and were sending their children to childcare. And the person who wrote this book obviously pointed out that it was a time of crisis, of gender upheaval, of male and female roles being questioned. And it resulted in children in tunnels for sex purposes, conspiracy theories. And they've traced it back throughout quite a long period of time where this has happened. The Nazi era turned to astrologers and alternative wellness. And I think Matthew touched a little on this, the fact that there is this nexus, and where there'll be this nexus because people are seeking out a sense of belonging, and it'll take on all different forms. So for me, how this has played out over the last 18 months is people reaching out to me. They saw me as somebody who was always questioning various statements and vested interests, and I'm very vocal on it, and I have used, I guess, my journalistic training to do this over the years. And they were reaching out to me saying, could you please get involved in this? Daniel Andrews is doing this horrific stuff. And they'd tell me about David Icke and the shape-shifting lizards and a whole range of different things, and desperately wanting me to join their tribe. They wanted me to be part of their sense of belonging. And it was when that happened that this idea that this is stemming from fear and it's a biological urge to connect that is surfacing and driving a lot of this phenomenon. Now, all of this is exacerbated by the rampant individualism of our culture today. And I'm not telling you anything new here, but humans have always existed in this tension between individual needs, or at least going after, pursuing our individual needs, and attending to the collective. Of course, we don't have fangs, we don't have poison, we don't have horns, but what we have is an ability to coalesce around a collective via myth and story. That is how we've risen to the top of the food chain, to put things in a very crude way. And what we've done, of course, is had various structures in place, what I call moral umpires, to ensure that we do respect the collective in that our individualism doesn't run rampant. So we've had unions, and we've had religious structures, we've had centralised governments, etc. Now, of course, neoliberalism has seen all of those moral umpires that provided guardrails to ensure that there was a nice, even balance between these two forces that enable our survival. They've been wiped off the football field, as I like to say. And so in the absence of these, as we, are in a crisis and we reach out to the collective, we reach out to sort of tribal forums or spaces which have not been socially tested, i.e. Facebook. They've not been, they don't have moral guidelines that we've all kind of agreed to. And we are also a culture that has not had moral discussion around some of these things. And so we're flying blind when we reach out to these tribes. And I think this in particular explains the crossover between the alt-right and the wellness or spiritual realm, because they're both acting from purely self-protecting interests. And what they're doing is collating in various groups, which of course then means that they become victim to algorithmic vested interests. And down the rabbit hole they go, meeting in some kind of weird kind of cesspool at the bottom. And so that is, I think, why you're seeing this conflation, this very odd overlapping in a Venn diagram, which I think none of us could have believed could happen. It's because they are reasonably marginalised fringe groups that have been taken down these paths to the same point. The other thing I'd throw into the mix is that distraction has also contributed to all of this. We are now an attention economy, technology and so on. We know the various arguments. And the studies that I came across when I was writing my book showed a very concerning inability to deep read and to read things like contracts or political sort of obligations and responsibilities. So Brexit was one that actually brought a lot of this science to the surface. Many people didn't even know what they were voting for because they had no ability or had lost the ability to read the finer print as to what they were actually voting for. So this actually poses a problem when the science involved in, say, a pandemic or the use of vaccines can be quite complex. And so it's very difficult to follow these kinds of arguments when we've lost that ability and we are so distracted and unable to sit with one task at a time. And I think Geoff referred to it as cognitive slippage. It means then we can actually fall into very didactic, simplistic black and white thinking. And when somebody like QAnon comes into the space and explains things in a us versus them very primitive way, we find ourselves attracted to it, because it saves us from having to deal with the nuances that life often requires. So what ends up happening, I referred to this in an article I wrote for The Guardian, we confuse truth for truthiness. as I say, I think the intentions of this wellness spiritual space or influences, they're very good in many instances. They are seeking truth, but due to these various factors, they're not necessarily arriving at truth. They're engaged in a truthiness, a sort of a virtuous truthiness. As I mentioned, there's an inability to decipher nuance. And so the outrage gets very misguided into this black and white didactic kind of thinking. It's also made worse by the fact that the leadership that we see around us is also engaged in this kind of thinking for the same reasons. And finally, I think it's made particularly bad by this idea that Timothy Morton raises in his book. He says that we are currently ensconced in these hyper objects. The problems of the world, the climate crisis, a global pandemic and so on, they are so huge that it's impossible for us to stand back and be able to view things objectively and make rational, sane decisions, because we're in the middle of it and it's so big, our poor human brains can't quite fathom what's going on. And so a bunch of cognitive dissonances kick in, which many of us here are very familiar with. The fear and the uncertainty and the overwhelm, I guess, taxes our prefrontal cortex and we go into a super primitive state. And so you see these spiritualists who are all about love and light suddenly supporting Trump and wearing Make America Great Again caps. You also see these people who've become anti-vaxxers supporting Trump for thinking that he's on the same page. And of course, Trump got a vaccine, I think the day he left the White House. And then you've got these people who are caught up in the Save the Children movement, very legitimate in many ways. Yet they have come to believe that Trump is somehow raising money somewhere in Alaska for this particular cause, and yet seem to forget or block out what he's doing in Mexico with children on the border down there. Another factor that's not often raised in this debate is that we are a culture with very little ability to deal with any kind of discomfort. And in fact, 90% of technological advancement in the last 30 years has been geared towards cocooning us from discomfort. We get instant answers. We don't have to be left wondering or sit in uncertainty as to whether our pizza will arrive at a particular time. And so this is something that we've become quite unused to, is this idea of discomfort. And so what we're seeing is wellness and spirituality is being used as a tool to prevent us from having to face discomfort. In my book, I refer to spirituality light. It again stems from this individualistic intolerance for discomfort. And so people are cherry picking the nice bits and forgetting about the second half of the tradition, the spiritual traditions around the world, and that is of sacrifice and serving the collective. So wearing a mask suddenly becomes an affront to the freedom that they like to espouse, rather than being seen as a noble act of civil engagement. The final point I'll just make is that in the past, when we have been facing a crisis, there's generally been an identifiable enemy out there. So World War II is the Nazis, there's been the communists and so on. And so mobilisation was quite easy. We could group around a collective against an enemy that was out there somewhere. But in the current situation, we are both the perpetrator and the victim. We are in this hyper object together, and it's a very, very hard thing to wrap our heads around. And so we construct an us versus them paradigm. And so we construct elites, this notion of these elites, Hollywood elites, these Washington, DC elites. And I can see why that, of course, would happen. And this is, again, another cognitive dissonance that happens during a crisis. So I guess what I'm trying to flag here is there are a range of broader sociological and biological reasons for what's happening. And these factors are impacting both the alt-right and the wellness spheres. And it means that they end up meeting in a very similar spot together. So I often get asked how to handle this scenario because, of course, I'm on social media. I come across people from both ends of the spectrum constantly. And I quote a Rumi poem. Of course, there's a Rumi poem for just about every scenario on the planet. And it's out beyond ideas of right doing and wrong doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. And I think that's precisely where we need to go in order to work our way around this issue and hopefully cure it. What does that look like? It means talking about the commonality we all have, and that is this idea of the fear and the doubt that we're feeling. When we can talk with other people at this level, we can find a commonality. And also to ask how their thinking might solve the issues that we're all feeling. So for instance, somebody who's anti-vaccines, we might ask them, well, how do you think we might want to look after everyone? So ultimately, I believe the way forward for all of us here is to become the better tribe to which the alt-right, the wellness realm, anyone who's feeling fear and disconnect at the moment can actually hook onto in this crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. So thank you to all of the panelists. I think it's been a very engaging session, and it did perhaps begin thinking that these presentations were quite disparate, but I think there were some common themes, and I just want to highlight a few of them before I go to the questions that also appeared very much throughout last night's and this morning's sessions. So many of you touched on kind of historical precedents for some of what's going on at the moment with contemporary conspirituality. There was discussion around interpretive communities, and we've done research and in the case study that Enchi and Emily presented on spiritual tribes, drawing on Nancy Ammerman's work. Affect came up time and time again, emotion, throughout all the presentations thus far, as did fear and this craving for belonging. So I think all of those themes really sit well within the overarching colloquium. I have a question, but I'm actually going to reserve my question because we do have a few here, and I've had a chance to talk quite a lot over the last day. So there is a question here that was to Matthew from Neville that Matthew has answered in the chat, but I am just going to pose it because not everyone is reading the comments. So the question from Neville Bach, I'm not sure about the pronunciation. Although we can draw a line from 19th century idealism, different versions, into 20th century fascism, would you agree that the collapse of idealism in the early 20th century has assisted the problem of communication for conspirituality with an overshift in behavioralism and certain versions of realism, which have become the popular discourse? So that's to Matthew.
Thanks, Neville. Yeah, I just asked for some clarification in the private chat, which Neville's given me. He comments that there's a kind of, if I can't see it, I won't believe that it's true sort of mentality that he's, I think, concerned about. And I was just going to comment that it reminds me of something the great political scientist Franz Neumann talked about in a wonderful piece called Anxiety in Politics, which is all about the rise of what he calls Caesarist regimes, which we would call, I guess, populist. And he argues that conspiratorial thinking is characterized by what he calls false concreteness. So in the face of complexity and as Sarah's pointed out, I guess in the absence of, single identifiable sort of anthropomorphic causes, somebody did this and therefore we're all suffering, people kind of regress and become very attracted to precisely that kind of narrative. Rather than accept complexity, and in the case of something like a pandemic, of course, rather than accepting that what this sort of just really means, perhaps, is that we're part of a natural order that's much larger than the species, and we're not in control of all the levers. So if I've interpreted Neville's question right, I hope that speaks to it.
Thank you, Matthew. Okay, I'm just going to go on because I want to get through some of these questions. So there's a question to the entire panel from Andrew Singleton. So I might just get Geoff to chime in first and then Sarah. To what extent is the conservative media, who have dog-whistled to the conspiracy theorists and neo-fascists, responsible for magnifying distrust and disinformation, or are they merely complicit? And Matthew, you can certainly chime in here too.
Tempting as it is to point the finger at Fox and its ilk, I mean, I think we have to face it that contemporary fascist groups are adept at entering polarized discussions and colonizing them, which is exactly what's happening, I think, with the wellness movement at the moment. It's what happened with the computer gaming movement around Gamergate. It's a conscious and deliberate meta-political strategy to create fronts and to recruit out of them. And so I think that conservative media figures like Alex Jones and Jerome Corsi are probably closer to being culpable in this field, but we really have to, I think, acknowledge that the fascists themselves have agency, and distasteful as the conservative media can be with their Trump boosterism and their often irresponsible journalistic standards, they're not creating this, at least they're not creating what Helen and I are discussing. We've got a real problem, and it won't go away just because Fox Media cleans up its act. In fact, it'll just migrate to somewhere else.
Thank you. Sarah, do you want to go?
Yeah, as a veteran also of mainstream media and standard media, I know how it works. And I agree with Geoff's assessment. These groups, these QAnon, etc. groups, those alt-right groups, they're mostly about creating chaos. They know exactly what they're doing. That's their modus operandi. And so media plays into that. And of course, media likes to report on sensationalism, chaos, etc. So I would say the responsibility that media has in all of this is to be awakened to what's going on, that they're being played. There's a responsibility to the community, but there's also just an awareness of their own place in this. I see a lot of these commentators as victims. They don't realise they're being played. So, yes, the media does have a role to play, and there needs to be a lot more awareness. And I think what we're seeing in Finland and other parts of Europe, where media organisations are getting fake news training so that they can identify when they're being played and when it's appropriate to report on things, and when it's really, fueling the fire.
The other dimension that we could think about, and this is something that Geoff and I have written about a little bit together, is just how prevalent conspiracy narratives are. I'm not thinking so much of in the media, but as in popular culture in the last, I would say, 20 years at least. How many, thriller novels there are. The Da Vinci Code was probably one of the first really big ones I was aware of, but just how normalized conspiracy narratives that speak directly to, government corruption, weird sort of borderline satanic stuff, these sorts of ideas are really normalized and really familiar. So they start to make sense when you see them in a, this is a reality, in reports that are claiming to be true. They're so familiar from fiction, video games, film, television, that they become more believable.
There was an interesting article someone wrote actually about, did the X-Files pave the way for, conspirituality and yeah. So Matthew, is there anything you want to add there, or should we just move on?
I think we should just move on. I think they're great answers.
Okay, great. Thank you. So there's a question here for Sarah next. How do the different social media platforms contribute to the conspiracy epidemic? It's from Kaz Ross.
Oh, yeah. Well, I would say that Facebook is the worst for it. It's built for this kind of thing, and it also tends to attract a demographic, a particular demographic. And so I think, and some of the other panelists may have a take on this, but I think it's the sort of the baby boomer age group that tend to be particularly vulnerable to conspiracy theories, merely because they're not used to the fact that this kind of stuff can go on social media platforms, and they tend to be on Facebook. So I think the algorithms are particularly sophisticated on Facebook. Instagram, it's really quite hard to get traction with any of these ideas. It's quite hard to go down rabbit holes because it's visually based. The comments are where some of the trolly things can take off, but they don't go very, very far. In fact, they stay within the post. And then, of course, there's Twitter. And Twitter tends to attract, I find, in Australia, and it is different from country to country, but in Australia, it doesn't tend to get, it tends to attract a more of an academic vigor. It's a lot of journalists and academics who tend to be on Twitter. So even though they can actually do algorithmic acrobatics there, it tends to be Facebook where most of it's happening. And that's where you've got to be particularly careful. Yeah.
Thank you. There's a question here from Alex Rajinski, a member of our team. It says it's for Sarah, Geoff and Helen, but Matt, you might want to speak to it as well. And then I have one question I would like to ask, but we do have a little bit more time, I think. So if others would like to ask more questions, please go ahead. So this question is, there are common themes in your presentation surrounding the line between reality and fiction. To what extent do some of these spokespeople or leaders know that they are walking that line? And maybe if we start with Helen and Geoff, or Geoff and Helen.
Look, I don't know. I think it's, you know, I never really like to speculate about what somebody else genuinely believes or not. And I think my take on it is that it doesn't actually matter that much whether they believe it, because the impacts are in what they say and do, rather than in what they think.
And I would add to that, supporting it completely, that the distinction that we were introducing between truth and truthfulness goes to the idea that the reality versus fiction way of framing that is perhaps not as helpful in understanding why people become adherents of ideas that are debunked or being debunked, than the idea that an idea can be seen as, although untrue, truthful to reality in the required sense. It's what universally happens in typical cases. And of course, from our reflective standpoint as investigators, we would say that's the attitude that one adopts to a fiction. But it doesn't follow from that the person who believes that is truthful says, well, I know all very well this is a fiction, but nonetheless I shall continue to believe in it. I think that they simply adopt the attitude which is adopted typically towards fiction.
I would agree with that. I would just say the study that I mentioned in my presentation speaks to the fact that people will in fact share false information that when they're questioned, they'll admit that, well, it's potentially fiction and probably likely fiction, but they'll share it anyway. And I think that leaders and spokespeople will often do this because they're also trying to cultivate a sense of belonging and a tribe mentality. And I think that that's probably more what's at play. And of course, then the fiction becomes reality once people start to galvanize behind it. People forget where the story, actually came from.
Matthew, just before you answer, there's just a comment here from Neville, and then you can speak to that. Surely Matthew has shown that belief are important even for self-belief. Oh,
sorry, is that for me, Anna? Sorry.
Just as a prompt to your then response as well. It's in the Q&A. Neville has said, surely Matthew has shown that beliefs are important even for self-belief.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to jump in on the other discussion, but perhaps this will speak to what Neville was saying as well.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems to me that, there's this old idea in philosophy of two truths. It comes from medieval philosophy. And it's sort of, I think there are two truths that are operating in a lot of, particularly these more radicalized agents. You've got a kind of a scorn for factual truth in some of the really cynical operators. And the kind of Goebbelsian kind of approach that whatever works is good. But that's backed up by a sense that there's a larger truth here, which Geoff, I think, is gesturing towards in some ways. It's both a larger truth of the kinds of things that characteristically do happen, because there are nasty elites and all that sort of stuff. But also, if you believe that, then the larger truth is what Heidegger called the inner truth and greatness of the movement. And for that, then little lies and so on, and playing a little bit loose with the truth is really a small price, because we're dealing with civilizational transformation for some of these really radical kind of individuals. So, Yeah, I mean, I think some of them, I mean, I think it would vary across cases, of course, but some of them I think might be quite cynical about a lot of what they're propounding. And I took that to be a suggestion from what Geoff and Helen had said about some of the Q stuff. But at another level, I think they're quite sincere. There's a truth here. It's a capital T.
Okay, there is another question that will supersede mine for now from Darius Kaur. How can academics address the issue of conspiracy theories and denials of truth without becoming subject to charges of illiberalism or becoming epistemic authoritarians themselves? Matthew and Geoff and Helen can jump in, and then Sarah, if there's anything you want to add.
As an outsider, potentially.
Okay. How can we do it without becoming authoritarians ourselves? Well, surely part of the refutation of these theories, Darius, is to suggest that we don't know everything, and to try to inculcate a toleration that Sarah's pointed to, that we're sort of losing perhaps collectively, to generalise for dealing with uncertainty and not knowing. And I guess to inculcate in our students, those of us who are teachers, the ability to not be part of a tribe, but to be part of the tribe of inquirers. That's how I would suggest. Is that easy? No. Am I good at it? No. But do I think I should be better at it? Yes. Geoff?
Yeah. I imagine that, Darius, what you mean is epistemic absolutism, because authoritarianism is usually a term reserved for politics and morality, and it refers to issues of control over the actions of others and the kind of punishments that people who violate norms can be said to be, have deserved. So epistemic authoritarianism, if it's reframed as epistemic absolutism, the idea that there is one and only truth and that academics are in possession of it, well, no. Truth is authoritative, though, and I think that's what Matt is also saying, that by saying that there are procedures for finding out the truth of claims, and by making the assumption that reality is one, there's one reality and you can test claims against it as well as against logic. The procedure is absolute, even though the results are relative. So we don't have all of the answers, nor do we purport to, but crikey Jiminy, if we abandon the notion that we are seeking the truth and that the truth is authoritative insofar as we provisionally can grasp it, then don't we play into the hands of the fascists who wish to actually promote not just epistemic but also moral relativism in the interests of quite inhumane and authoritarian ideas?
I will just chime in there to the extent that as an outsider who, I haven't heard this kind of language since I was studying philosophy of the universe, I think 30 odd years ago. I would say that the role of academics is not to pull back from what they know and not to pull back from their research and their authority, but to own it and to create a compassionate, charming sort of tribe-like vibe around what they're doing, so that it becomes something that other people are inquisitive about and want to be part of. And I think that's an enticing role, I would hope, for academics. So I wouldn't pull back from being quite emphatic about what you know and through your particular lens. At this time in history, I don't think we should be apologising for any kind of intellectualism. There's a dearth of it, and I think those, in particularly in Australia. So please don't hold back. I agree, authoritarianism isn't the way to go, but drawing lines in the sand and being firm leaders in this debate, please keep it going.
I think, we're always open.
Oh, Helen, sorry.
Sorry, Anna. I think as academics, my experience on social media, and I do a bit on Twitter, is that whatever you say in whatever form, you are always open to a charge of those sorts of things. Aren't you? Oh, you've critiqued somebody's film, well, you're taking away white culture and what do you expect people to do but become terrorists because you're ruining their culture. And you think, well, I was talking about a movie. So, you know, you're always open to those sorts of accusations from people who've already made up their mind, but you're also having those conversations in part with the people that who are reading the argument but not having it. And if you leave that space open and if you leave that space open, then there's no voice, and people who haven't made up their minds only ever hear one perspective. And so, you know, it's really nice to hear that from you, Sarah, because I always have thought that if you don't engage publicly as an academic, and if you're not willing to delineate what you know and why and present your case, then it's just open for anybody to claim whatever they like.
We need you. Don't give up.
Seems, yeah, a good place to kind of begin to wrap up, particularly given our you know, theme is on science and spirituality and COVID-19. And I think, but what's interesting to me as well in another theme that's come up over the day, particularly at the end of the panel of vaccine hesitancy, which was very interesting. And I think it touches on some stuff that Sarah said earlier on as well, is that, and actually in all the presentations, that it is important to kind of understand some of these underlying fears and insecurities and doubts. And it is important to put forward scientific evidence and our research and to communicate it in ways that are accessible, but that it's also really important that we stay open to the fact that things can be wrong, things can be, you know, new evidence can be found to disprove other, you know, theories. And I think it was Tom in the vaccination hesitancy debate said, you know, that if scientists also communicate in that kind of way with very much openness and honesty within that debate, it might actually help things rather than set things up in such a sort of us versus them way. And I guess that was my question. I don't know if we have time to answer it, but what, again, it's come out of some of the other themes and out of your discussion, some of the other sessions around this notion of belonging, that there is a sense of wanting to belong, but that there's sort of something else in it from the far right, but also from the conspiritualists and within wellness tribes and industry, that there's a sort of sense of wanting to also have an exclusive or superior sense of, you know, tribe that then plays into this us versus them. I'm a sociologist of religion, so of course, you know, that's in there in a lot of theory that we've been studying around religion and extremism and religion and violence. So would you like to just speak to that a little bit more? It was something Tom also said in his data when he did this modeling around vaccine hesitancy, like a really robust study, and fear came up. He expected fear to come up as the #1 driving factor. But what came up was more like scarcity. So again, around these sort of exclusive narratives of the truth, having sort of some ownership of some kind of, yeah, exclusive secret like dimension, which is also sort of part of these spiritual tribes and codes. I'm sorry, I've kind of asked maybe quite a complex question, but trying to draw out some of this stuff that's been coming up over the last 24 hours. Yeah.
Can I start, and then I think it'll throw to probably Sarah, because I'm interested in what she might have to say about this, having moved in that space. But I mean, for me, it strikes me that disagreement is part of life, but we seem to be moving into a culture where the ability to disagree but respect that others have reason and have reasons for their belief, and to be open enough to sort of engage with them and potentially be persuaded, or at least think that they're not completely crazy or possibly malign. That's really eroding. And it seems to me that belonging is natural, necessary, and legitimate as a kind of longing, and that happens in epistemic kind of processes. You know, we want to fit into a group and so on and so forth. But obviously, the excess of that desire to belong, as you say, Anna, becomes this. Well, our group's got it right, And if you're not in our group, then, well, clearly you don't know anything, or you're possibly, as I say, crazy or malign. And this speaks to that concern about how do we rebuild? How do we rebuild a common culture that is not going to kind of fragment into these wild spaces? And that was where I thought I might throw to Sarah, because I thought she was kind of moving towards asking that question as well.
Look, I think the sense of belonging and tribal kind of cohesion and everything is part of it. But I actually also think, and, you know, Anna, you're sort of suggesting this, is that people are also feeling such a loss of control, and there is nothing sturdy or steady in our lives anymore. And so a sense of agency, a sense of being on the right side of the truth, is a way of feeling like you have some firmness and stability in your life. And I think that sort of, that sense of agency, being the expert, knowing while others don't know, makes you feel that, you know, there's something sturdy beneath your feet. I think it also plays into that idea that I mentioned of the enemy. We desperately need somebody out there who is the opposite of us, so that we can feel safe. That is the way that we as humans work in a crisis in particular. And so if you can portray someone as wrong, and if you can get on your high horse with your right information, especially the exclusivity of your information, like not everybody has it, you know, then I think that that can make you feel safe as well.
Thank you. Geoff and Helen, do you have any very final quick comments? We've gone a little over time, but we can just wrap this up if you want to add anything to that.
We think that narrative simplifies, and that it's narratives aren't cognitive maps, they're affective maps. So we fully endorse the idea that the kind of mapping that happens in conspiracy is about belonging and about empowerment. So it's normative and affective. It's not really cognitive. The cognitive is a pretext for the actual text of what's being said.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to wrap everything up. Thank you to everyone. We did get everyone's questions answered. I think what's coming through now. Oh, sorry. There are other things, but we don't have time. But there were thank yous. Particularly for affirming the need for academics to engage in the public sphere in accessible ways, and that was valued by practitioners also. So look, I'm so great that this panel came together, and it's been really wonderful to have the philosophers and also people from literature and from other parts of other departments within our uni that work on these ideas to bring everyone together. And Sarah, a special thank you to you for making time to be here today. All of these sessions will be recorded, and then they'll be put, together. So when they're viewed together with the other, we had sessions this morning with the conspirituality.net. That content's going to sit really well with Sarah's presentation, and the presentation last night with David Voas and Mar and David Robertson, I think also really plays into a lot of what was said today across the three papers. So once again, thank you. And it'll be great that more people can listen to your insights and your experiences online after the colloquium has ended. All right, I'm just going to put in a quick plug for the next session. So we're taking just a short break. We've got another 10 minutes break, actually, which I think we all need because we've had really quite short breaks between some of the morning sessions. So go have a cup of tea or go and stretch, move. And the final session is another one on conspirituality, QAnon and the far right. I'll be chaired by Andrew Singleton, and we'll be back soon. Thanks again to everyone. Thanks for the questions too. Thank you. Bye.